And he was the first African president who held elections knowing that he would lose. It was a very rare event.
Okay, maybe the same happened in Ghana with
Yeah,
Williams.
right.
Good morning. My name is Jamie Barnett, and I am the Senior Vice President here at Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome to you who are in the audience here. We, in addition to having an august group of speakers today, we have an august set of people in the audience as well, and we welcome the folks that with C-SPAN and as well as our own webcast. Thank you for being with us today. The Potomac Institute for Policy Studies is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan think tank on science and technology. And on behalf of our CEO, Mike Swetman, who was on travel today, otherwise he would be here, welcome to our discussions today, which are really ripped from the headlines. Our Middle East security concerns, the next phase. I first became interested in the Middle East when I was a young naval officer, and one of the only ones that you can find around now is actually visited Iran. I went to Bandar Abbas and Karg Island as a young naval officer, all throughout the Middle East, Bahrain and Kuwait. I was there for Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And just as it was in the 70s, it is now a focus for us. With the things that are happening in Syria, with what we see within Iran, in Egypt, and across the Middle East, so many issues, and that's why we need our experts to bring clarity to what the next phase is, what's happening now, and so I'm really excited to be able to be in the audience today for this discussion. I might add that just one program note that we will be having another one of Yona Alexander's, Dr. Yona Alexander, who is our moderator today. We'll be having an event that I want to tell you about in just a minute. But let me tell you about Yona Alexander. This is also one of my privileges here, is to get to work with Yona Alexander, and he heads up our International Center for Terrorism Studies. He's also the director of the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies, and the International Centers, Inter-University Center for Legal Studies, which, along with Don Wallace at the International Law Institute, and we appreciate their sponsorship of this as well. Yona is one of the most prolifically published experts on terrorism in the world, really, and has edited such things as the Partnership for Peace Review, and then most recently, this past summer, brought out the Arab Spring a year later and beyond, the special report. He just does a tremendous amount of scholarship on this subject. And in January, on January 15th, he will be sponsoring leading at the National Press Club, Potomac Institute's update on terrorism, and also the outlook, which I think is always a very interesting discussion. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over, and if you would please help me welcome Professor Yona Alexander. Professor Yona? Thanks, sir. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Can I move this down or no? Okay. For your kind introduction, you really have to talk about us and not individuals, because, as I always said, together we're better. And just to mention one more thing, since our colleague here, Mike Swetman, is not here, so I want to mention our Al-Qaeda book. This is the second book. The first one was published before 9/11. Now, first of all, if you would be kind to turn off your phones, this would help us. Where did I put my glasses? That's the whole question. At any rate, here it is. I would like to welcome everyone to our roundtable discussion. You know, in the Middle East, I'm sure many of you know, there is this Khamsin season, if you will. The shifting shifting winds in the Middle East. And one of them, if you prepare a program on the Middle East, you never know. And things are changing. One of the panelists supposed to participate from Congress had to leave immediately for the Middle East. I don't know what he's doing, but at any rate, but fortunately, we found a way to deal with that. And I will introduce, the panel now for one second. Minister Katz, right here, who is Minister of the Embassy of Israel, former Ambassador to Nigeria and Ghana. Dr. Michael Ledeen is a Freedom Scholar now at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. I will mention some of his accomplishments later on. Dr. Kamar Uda from the U.S. Institute of Peace, Issam Saliba, and you can see I have the old one, but then we changed. We do have Dr. Tafik Hamid, who is going to join us and will discuss some of her accomplishments later on. Now, before I turn it over to our panelists, I just want to mention 2 points. One, as academics, and usually academics are both observers and participants, we try to learn the past lessons, and we try to anticipate the future challenges and develop some sort of response strategies in terms of concepts and doctrines and various structures on the national and regional and global levels. Now, for example, Jamie mentioned our activities last week or so. We had a conference on maritime security, the threat assessment and response strategies. And looking back at our seminars at the Potomac and elsewhere for the past couple of years, dozens and dozens of seminars focusing on a great variety of issues, all the way from Iran and U.S. Policy to the Middle East weapons mass destruction, past experiences, future outlook, to the UN-Palestinian case, study Syria after Assad, and Turkey's partnership for security, diplomatic security, etc., etc. So again, we were quite busy, actually not only the past couple of years, but I would say in the past 50 years. Now, if I may, I just want to mention a couple anniversaries which are relevant to our discussion today. Last month, for example, we marked the 56th anniversary of the Suez crisis, the withdrawal of the French, British, and Israeli forces from the Suez Canal zone. It's marked as Victory Day, and we learned the great lessons. I won't go into details, but I just want to mention some of those in our discussion today. The other one is the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the Hamas, the beginning of the Intifada, and there was a great deal of press on Khalid Mashal visit now to Gaza. And I recall, again, on a personal level, more than 25 years ago when I interviewed members of the Hamas that wasn't actually formally the Hamas in the underground in the mosque in Gaza. Now, the other anniversary on a personal level I want to mention is the Pan Am 103, Lockerbie, when some of my students from Syracuse University were killed, and obviously Libya was involved in this particular case, and there are many, many other anniversaries. But, you know, there is a daily menu. If you look at the situation in the Middle East, yesterday, today, all the way from Syria, the report about the Al-Qaeda-linked rebels who are moving towards the capture of Safira, which is the base of chemical weapons of the government. Just imagine what might happen if some of the Al-Qaeda people will be able to have the weapons of mass destruction. Or the report about the arms smuggling shipment towards Gaza and Sinai that was aborted in Napoli. I'm talking about the daily menu. You cannot escape that. Or the situation in Egypt, the confrontation between President Morsi and the opponents, or the Al-Qaeda leader in the Maghreb, for example. He threatened the French and the African states not to intervene in Mali and so on. So again, this was yesterday. Tomorrow, for example, we're going to see the visit of Secretary Clinton in Morocco to meet the king, to talk about strategic partnership, to talk about Mali, to talk about Syria, to talk about the humanitarian issue. And then the following day, there is a meeting in Morocco again, Friends of Syria. According to the reports, probably 100 delegations are going to deal with a common strategy to deal with a political transition in Syria. Now, if I may, one last point. I think we have to deal with the issue of the Middle East not only on a vertical level, meaning specific countries, but on the horizontal challenges across the region. For example, the political, in terms of the crisis of identity, the crisis of leadership, extreme national identity, for example, separatism, the sociological aspects, the educational, the intellectual. In other words, the dimension of the culture of life versus the culture of death. The economic, in terms of population explosion, unemployment, organized crime, the drug trafficking, trafficking of people and goods and so on, piracy, the energy inequality and so on, the technological aspect, the electronics, the cyber, and finally, I think in terms of the ethnic, racial, religious, and tribal intolerance in violence. So all of these issues, I think, are going to be discussed across the region, as well as in terms of specific countries. Now, I would like to suggest that today we are going to have a roundtable discussion, meaning that instead of the traditional lectures, we're going to have the individuals speak to make an opening statement, possibly five minutes, since we have many panelists and we have also people in the audience who can contribute to our discussion. So we don't have a square, a round table, we have a square or whatever you can call this table, but I think the most important thing is that we'll follow up with the discussion with the audience. I'm going to keep the time and just warn the panelists that they have 1 more minute. It's the red line. And simply so we can keep the discussion going. And hopefully, I think we will have a most interesting debate in terms of the role of the United States, the Europeans, the countries in the region. And the first one would be, as I mentioned, Noam Katz, the minister of the Israeli embassy, who served also in, I mentioned, in Nigeria, in Ghana. Also he served in Rome, and he's a graduate of the Hebrew University, and he spent time in kibbutz Kabri, that I know very well, because many of us have the experience going all the way back to participate in some of these activities that are really important historically for all of us. No?
From there.
Yeah, I think we'll start with that and then we'll move back.
Well, the title of this session is Security Concerns, and the real question to ask is what's new? And the answer, the simple answer is everything is new and nothing is new. When we look on recent eventualities in the Middle East, which are described as Arab uprising or Arab Spring, we need to understand that each place that we have these eventualities occurring is a unique environment for itself. And the reasons for whatever we see in Bahrain, Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Syria are inherent to those societies. Yet, there are a few common traits that we need to understand about the situation, at least as we perceive it from an Israeli angle. First, we know that in each place, it's something that is domestic. It was not aiming against Israel or against any foreign domination. It's not against colonialism or imperialism or even against us, as I said. It's about will of people to change the structure of their social and political life. They would like, in each society, the people that are going to the street want that their voice will be heard. If I want to be positive, I would say that it's about human dignity. It's about people that would like to influence their life. And another trait that we have to pay attention is that those people lost the fear of government. They are ready to go day after day to the street. They are ready to be killed, but they are not going to give up. And that influence also the ability of the future order that will be shaped to take control and to exercise authority in those places. What we see really is a period of change, dramatic change, strategic change in the Middle East, and the creation of new order. And if somebody is going to tell you for sure how it is going to develop, it probably has self-illusions and it tries to illusion you. So we have to be very modest about analyzing the future of this phenomena. What does it mean to us Israelis? It means, first, that all the security assumptions that we had working for us for 30 years are under a big question mark. A second thing that is important for Israel is to know that our ability to influence the different processes is very limited. We watch, we live there, it influences us, but our ability really to influence what is happening in those countries is limited. On the other hand, when we come to the strategic challenges of the State of Israel, not much has been changed. I can say that our challenges are focused around two different legs. First leg is the threat posed to us by Iran, and as we believe, not only for us, but for the entire international community, for peace and stability. And the other leg is our need to build and better our relations with our neighbors and to complete a process that will lead eventually to end the conflict between us and between our Palestinian neighbors. There is no change in our needs or in our basic policies, though the strategies varies because the situation is different. Anywhere, this is an Israeli perspective, anywhere when you see danger today in the Middle East, you see the fingerprints of Iran. And when we look around our borders and we look about what was happening or what is happening in Syria, we see Syria as a major member in an Iranian axis, and we see a massive involvement of Iran to keep the Bashar al-Assad regime in power. And we see Iran involved in Lebanon through the Hezbollah that took over Lebanon, in fact, just before the beginning of what we called Arab Spring, following the Hariri Tribunal. And we see how active Hezbollah is in trying to maintain Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria. And when we go south, we see Hamas, and we see Hamas and other organizations in Gaza that, while being indigenous, genuine Palestinian movements, are also Iranian proxies. And in fact, if I have to say one word about the Gaza operation that took place 2 weeks ago, ended 2 weeks ago, it was a clash between an Iranian proxy and Israel, and one of our major achievements was the ability to cripple the long-range missiles that were a branch of Iran on our southern border. I read in one of the articles published over the weekend, somebody comparing it to Soviet missiles in Cuba. So maybe they are not nuclear, but they are strategic weapons of Iran on the southern border of Israel. This was fully destroyed. When we speak about Iran, it's important to say the major threat, the unprecedented threat that is posed by Iran to Israel and to world stability is stemming from its nuclear military ambition. And that is the thing that has to be stopped. And Israel here in the United States has similar understanding of the threat and similar understanding of the strategy. So we believe that the strategy should be a combination of the utmost possible pressure on Iran, diplomatic and economic pressure. We need even, we believe that there is a need to change the state of mind about these sanctions, not to go in an incremental way that from time to time we boycott or we put pressure on some elements, but we think that everything should be boycotted unless it was permitted because of humanitarian reasons, because we believe that the time is short. And on the other hand, we strongly believe that there is a need to build credible military option and to be ready to use it if necessary. And Israel believes that it is important to pose to the Iranian regime red lines that will allow the Iranian regime to understand that there is a point that it cannot cross, it cannot buy more time around it. We think that that will allow maybe the Iranian regime a way to change a little bit their strategy and not to cross these red lines. And these red lines should be credible. I know that we had a kind of public dispute about red lines, but red lines, from our own perspective, are not a bad thing. We know that there are red lines that were posed to Syria because of the fear of that the Syrian brutal regime will use chemical weapons, and they have the third largest stockpile in the world of chemical weapons with sarin gas and VX and mustard gas that can be used against their own people in the bloody conflict that is going now in Syria. And Israel has a red line to Syria because we cannot allow that chemical weapons and weapons of that type will be transferred, and there will be a proliferation of these weapons into the hands of terroristic groups, Hezbollah or others that belong to the global jihad. It's a dangerous development. We need to understand also that Iran is fighting to maintain its influence in Syria because this is a major asset for it, but Syrian collapse is going to produce many other problems. And we need to be aware of that. Think Libya and think much bigger. It's not only about chemical weapons. The kind of arsenal, conventional arsenal that is to be found in Syria is much bigger and much more dangerous than the one that was in the hands of Libya. And Libyan weapons found their way into Gaza and into other places. Think about land-sea missiles that can impact shippings in the Mediterranean. Think about long-range missiles that are much more sophisticated than what is found in the hands today of some of the terroristic groups. Hezbollah has about 60 or 70,000, between 60 to 70,000 rockets and missiles in its hand. Think about the improvement in the quality of arsenal in their hands. Think about the breakdown of Syria into a constant war zone. Think about the global jihad that has a strong presence today, and now the United States is dealing with designating maybe Jabhat al-Nusra, but all these organizations are already there. In fact, the day after Assad has already started. So there is a strong security concern there. When we look at our southern border, we see Egypt, and we have strong interest to maintain the peace agreement with Egypt. We think that it is also an Egyptian interest. We would like Egypt to exercise its control on its borders. And in fact, while Egypt played a very constructive role in broking a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel recently, the future will be dictated by the ability to prevent Hamas from rearming itself. And Hamas was rearming itself mainly with Iranian, as I said before, Iranian weapons and capabilities. But we have to understand that these weapons flow either from Libya or from Iran via Sudan into Gaza Strip through Egyptian territory. And the build-up of Hamas was done since 2009 till 2012. And we have to see that this flow of arms will stop. So when it comes to Egypt, we follow what is happening in Egypt. We hope that Egypt will develop itself as a democratic country, more pluralistic, with strong open society. And we follow the eventualities there. We have no ability to influence them, and we have no intention to influence them, as we don't expect somebody to try to influence political process within Israel. But our key interest is to maintain the peace agreement with Egypt. One word about Palestinians. Israel is not changing its policy. We believe that the future solution for our conflict with the Palestinians will be along the lines of two-state solution, one Jewish Israel and one Arab Palestine. And we believe that the only way to achieve that solution will be around the negotiating table, and we still see the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas as potential partners to sit with us around the negotiating table, and if they will come today or tomorrow, we will sit with them, whether we are going to election or not going to election, because this is an Israeli interest. However, the other side is not interested to come to the negotiating table. Our understanding is that they have other priorities in mind. The legitimizing the state of Israel, achieving small victories, symbolic victories in the UN. This is not going to bring peace to us or the Palestinians. It will be achieved only around the negotiating table. And if they won't come, there won't be a status quo. There won't be a status quo. Israel has to maintain its strategic interest and to see that it will be able to protect itself and to defend itself. And we are going to take the necessary decisions for our own sake. We prefer to do it together and not by ourselves. So we are still waiting for Palestinians to come. I'll stop here. You'll be able to ask later. Thank you.
You crossed the red line. So thank you very much, Noam. for your remarks. Obviously, we'll come back, as I said, each one will speak. As an academic, I always have some footnote, and when you spoke about nothing, everything is new and nothing is new, but King Solomon, of course, famously said nothing is new under the sun, except he didn't think about the missiles, the technology, but he was wise to build a lot, actually, the Red Sea, the freedom of the seas, and so on. Now, the next speaker panelist is Dr. Michael Ledeen. As I mentioned, is currently a freedom scholar at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He obviously has a very rich background. Incidentally, you have the bios of the participants, and you can look at this. I just would mention a few highlights. I had the, as we say, honor, privilege to meet him at CSIS a million years ago when he was the editor of the Washington Quarterly, and he served with great distinction as advisor to the Secretary of State and to the State Department in general, the Defense Department and National Security Council and so forth. And is an academic who received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and was teaching also the Washington University in St. Louis and the University of Rome. And he published more than 20 books, and I look forward to his next publication.
Thank you, Yona. I'm going to have to report you for transporting this device from my dentist's office to the Potomac Institute. Well, Iran. I've been writing about Iran, talking about Iran, and getting into trouble about Iran now for something like 30 years. And it's a fascinating subject in the sense that there is no subject so important as Iran to the security of the United States and to the future of the United States. And yet, with amazing bipartisanship for all this period, every single American president, doesn't matter, left-wing, right-wing, Democrat, Republican, has always come to the conclusion that we could make a deal with Iran, and that it's just a matter of finding the right methods or the right proposals or the right setting or the right approach, and we will be able to normalize relations and go forward in a spirit of friendship and comity and so forth. And the only thing that distinguishes this administration from its predecessors is that its predecessors needed time to come to this conclusion. This administration came to office already with that conclusion. But in terms of actual conduct of policy, it's all the same. And the other fascinating thing about Iran to me in current circumstances is that all discussion of Iran is about nukes. Everything we hear about Iran is about nukes, with a few footnotes here and there. Yes, they're supplying weapons to Hamas. Yes, they provide safe haven training and so forth to various terrorist organizations. Yes, they are the backbone of the Assad regime. And when the insurrection started in Syria, we saw already Iranian snipers on rooftops in Damascus and Aleppo, and we saw Iranian trained forces, whether it's Revolutionary Guards Corps or Hezbollah, fighting side by side with the Syrian army, and then as the Syrian army became less effective, taking the place of Syrian army. But it all comes back to, if you look at the international meetings and resolutions in the United Nations and statements from leading policy officials throughout the Western world, doesn't matter where you look, it's all about nukes. And yet, if you want to, as the Washington Post said a couple of years ago, if you want to get on top of the nuclear question, if you want to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, the only way of doing it is regime change. And the one thing that nobody talks about in all these discussions, debates, panels, op-eds, and so forth, is the fact that Iran has been killing Americans nonstop since 1979, all over the world, and they're doing it today. We have two sons, Marine officers, who fought one in Iraq, the other in Afghanistan. And before they left, I said to each one, I said, you know, I have this obsession with Iran. I see Iran everywhere. I think they're involved in all these things and so on. Tell me. And the two of them, and our daughter also, who served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, all came back and said, you don't know how right you are. They're all over the place. I mean, you cannot miss it. Anyone who goes there and looks sees it. To the point where when our older son, first one, went to Fallujah in Iraq, he was astonished to find several storefronts with on the front of the storefront the photograph of the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. So, I mean, they're there openly. It's not even a secret. They're not even trying to hide it. And every now and then a member of the bin Laden family, sometimes a daughter, sometimes a son, sometimes a nephew, stand up and say, hey, we're here in Iran, somebody get us out of here, help us. Well, they're not, I mean, they could leave anytime they wanted to. They're there because they want to be there and they're getting things from Iran that they need. And so it has been all along. And yet the fact that Iran kills Americans all the time, that never appears in the policy debate. Nobody cares. Only military families care. And that's a very small proportion of the American public. It's not part of the broader policy debate. We don't talk about it. And yet in all of this, so Iran is at the center of our security concerns. And not only in the Middle East. They're now part of a global alliance, which includes all kinds of countries in South and Central America, whether it's Venezuela, or whether it's Bolivia, or whether it's Nicaragua, or Ecuador, and so forth. I mean, amazing, all over the place. Banking arrangements, smuggling of weapons, oil moving, spectacular explosion, mushroom style, of Shiite mosques in South America, which is not the tradition of South America, if you know what I mean. All over the place. What are they doing there? And who are the people who go to these mosques? And what are they talking about inside the mosque? Very interesting, this famous flight that goes from Tehran to Caracas, sometimes once a week, sometimes twice a week, lands at a special ramp at the airport in Caracas. People get off it. Who are they? We don't know. They're carrying some kind of passport, but as they get off the plane, they're given Venezuelan passports. And they're gone. What are they doing? Where have they gone to? And so forth. There are scores of Iranians who have been part of the Western world's famous arrest and release program in the United States, arrested in the southern desert of the United States near the Mexican border, arrested, asked a few questions, and then sent on their way. What were they here for? Where are the documents on these people? What do we know about them? Et cetera, et cetera. All we know is that the supreme leader stands up with great regularity in the streets of Tehran and other major cities in Iran and leads chants of death to America. You've all seen them. Everybody's seen them. Thousands of people, death to America, death to America. What do you think it means? What's the meaning of death to America? What are they talking about? Well, I put it to you that it's not a street party. It's not some kind of popular indigenous kind of celebration, which is otherwise meaningless in policy terms. No, they fully intend it, and they're working for it. And they're trying very hard to do it. Paradoxically, Iran today resembles nothing so much as the Soviet Empire in its final days. It's a hollow regime. The people hate it. We see that. In 2009, millions of people took to the streets to protest against the electoral fraud, which was really a pretense for them to demonstrate against a regime that they hate and which they want to bring down. There were more people demonstrating against the regime of the Islamic Republic in 2009 than ever demonstrated against the Shah in the late 1970s. Huge crowds. The response of the Western world in the 1970s was to support the demonstrators against the Shah, who was a friend of the West. The response of the Western world in 2009 was to support the regime, which is an enemy of the West, against the people who wanted to bring it down. That is the situation in which we find ourselves today. It's a terrible situation. It's completely nuts. And yet to bring them down, the only thing that the Western world has to do is do what it claims to stand for, which is to support people who are willing to fight and die for freedom in their own countries on behalf of values that we all say we share. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. We didn't even have to use the red line. We'll come back to you. You know, as you were thinking about Iran and for decades, and you know the situation on the ground, I just remembered two specific quote-unquote academic related incidents to Iran. One of them, some 25 years ago, we had a conference on preventing nuclear terrorism, and we got the registration and a check from someone from Iran who wanted to come to attend the event. The check was sent back, but just about 10 days ago, I received a request for an internship that we have for many years from someone from the Revolutionary Guard member who wanted to come here and do research and to help us out with our work. And I don't know how to respond to that, but at any rate, the Iranians are all over, and we'll come back to that. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Kamar Uda, is currently a senior program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace in the Religion and Peacemaking Center and a scholar in Islam at the Institute, Islamic Theology, Intellectual History, and so forth, author of many publications, for example, the Crescent and Dove, on peace and conflict resolution in Islam. He was educated at UCLA, and he was teaching comparative religion at Boston College, the College of Holy Cross, and Brandeis University. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and I'd like to thank the organizers for putting such an important discussion together. And I'm struck by our conversation so far, starting and almost staying with this. It's almost the same. Nothing's changed. It's on my notes, but I think acknowledging there's been some change, but so much is the same underneath the sun. Given the past year and a half, I think there are major paradigm shifts in the region, and I think most of us who are following the Middle East would agree in some way or fashion. I'd like to start, before I make my comments on security challenges and what I think are the 2 or 3 most important things to consider, I'd like to really take back to us to a time where I think some of us forget, or want to forget, or maybe want to remember, that the period of 10 years of 1963 to 1973, just to start off my conversation, is that if you were the ambassador from the United Kingdom, and you came to the United States, and you're admirer of this country, but from 63 to 73, you see an assassination of the president, you see his brother assassinated, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the city riots for 3 months in a row, student divisions and killings of students, yeah, The Vietnam War polarizing the country, Operation Phoenix, right, supposedly eliminating the Viet Cong, but then it became stronger to eventually then lead the country. You must be thinking, what's going on to this country? What is happening in these past 10 years? And I just outlined some 5 or 6 major things. But what is happening? What is pulling this country apart? And I bring that together back here, and the reasons that the country stayed together is because of our strong institutions, I think. Right? Strong institutions, civil society institutions, and legal institutions. But in that same, let's say, you want to call it semi-chaos or same period, we're witnessing some of the similar things in the Middle East. That same sort of uncertainty, inability to navigate and see what's going to happen. And in that uncertainty, we're making all these reactions and sort of forecast. And I think the forecast of 66, 67, 16 may have never thought we were going to get through to 2012 and at this stage. So in that, I just want to bring that as sort of a reminder of how to navigate through some of the uncertainties in the Middle East and security challenges in the Middle East. I think it reminds us that what is happening is not the end game. You know? These are processes, I think the colleague from the Embassy of Israel said very clearly, it's something you can influence, but you don't you have limitations of those influence. You may have certain colleagues and friends in these different nations, but it's not ultimately up to external forces or nations to how this is going to play out. Although the best part is that you need to be involved, right? And not think exclusively. What we're finding also is that as much as there are challenges from Morocco to the Gulf states and beyond, that 9/11 taught us that whenever a country gives space and it's fragile, that space allows terrorists to recruit, train, and execute their work. And I think in this background, we're using the same framework to think about Libya, the chaos of Egypt, chaos of Yemen, chaos of Bahrain, and Syria, and other places. And I think that's important to think that we're using that same framework, but whether there are limitations in that framework. It's playing out in Libya. Clearly, we've seen that without strong institutions, institutions of rule of law, we saw what happened in September, the assassination of our ambassador and 3 foreign service colleagues. We saw, and it reveals that there's a whole network of extremists who are being funded from various groups and places, but we're unsure as to their end game, what they wish to have. And it's also, in this process, we're also questioning and thinking about the administration's counterterrorism policy and whether it's successful or not. After Iraq and Afghanistan, are we in a better place in the region? And I would dovetail my colleague who spoke before that Iran may be in a better place after Iraq and Afghanistan's war, and more influential in the region, but also more influential on the ground. We have lost, unfortunately, a lot of legitimacy in our most closest allies in Egypt, in Yemen, and of course, on the ground, I would say in Turkey too, who have seen on view the West as flip-flopping on the issue of Syria. So that's one area that perhaps we should rethink about frameworks, strategies, or concepts, and whether the 9/11, post 9/11, is application to a post-Arab Spring is even strong, or it has its inadequacies. My second point is, I think in dealing with Middle East security challenges, I would ask us to think about this policy of drones, and the limitations of the drones. I think it's been held as a very successful. There's a lot of wins, there's low cost, low risks. It's a quick way to defeat, quote unquote, terrorists, break up the networks, and so forth. It is not very costly military campaigns. And we held up the flag of the drone policy after the assassination and killing of Osama bin Laden. But we're finding that the drone policies are creating greater divisions, and they're just able to recruit and train in places where the drones are not being used. For instance, Ayman Zawahiri urged Libyans to attack in Libya. After that one-day attack, they went ahead in Benghazi. We see that the drones were used in Yemen, being used in other places in Pakistan, but we're losing influence in these places drastically to a point where these governments may not be as stable as we wish them to be. We found that while Al-Qaeda may look futile and disorganized, but now they have a great deal of influence in Mali, in parts of Libya, and the Middle East, North Africa region in the Middle East. I think we need to rethink about a policy that is principally built on drone strikes, and to rethink about these havens that then filtered out as sort of concentric circles of different fringe groups. They had no interest at all to work with Al-Qaeda, but now they're best friends because of a certain policy. Who would have thought in Syria that Al-Qaeda is working with the opposition group, and the opposition group has lost a great deal of interest or support, or a belief that the West will support them, have now moved towards Al-Qaeda fighters to defeat the Assad regime. Who would have thought this would have happened? Who would have thought that Al-Qaeda fighters and its fringe groups would be even a factor in Libya? But we see the group Ansar Sharia to be having links with them, the friends of this group. So my 2 points was to rethink about our frameworks, particularly given the limitations of it. And there's a new strategy that's needed. I think it's very important. Even to rethink about sort of this influence of Iran and how it's done and how it's not done, but at the same time our losing influence in the region, but also to rethink about a policy that may attack the head of the fish, but also there may be other species willing to take the organization and move forward in making the region destabilize and so forth. My last note is we have several states now during the Arab Spring that is very fragile, right? Almost mirrors what Afghanistan may have been before 9/11. From Libya to Syria to Yemen. Egypt was an exception. I think a colleague will talk about Egypt. But that sort of state is important to think about, rethinking, reconsidering what has happened to the state and how we need to build up these states as soon as possible through civil society support, rule of law, and other means. These are my few comments to the conversation at this moment. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for providing that context. And what's very interesting that I think we'll discuss later on, that the process is unending. We look at the consequences of the collapse of the old order, and we were in the dark as far as what new structures are going to be established. This is very similar to what happened after the end of the Cold War. At any rate, we'll come back to it a little bit later on. Our next speaker is Isam Saliba, who is a Middle East specialist at the Law Library of Congress. Is an international attorney focusing on the Middle East, and He practiced both in Lebanon and the United States, and lectured many universities. Again, on a personal and academic level, I'd like to mention that we had the opportunity to be part of a academic delegation on the second track, I can say it now, diplomacy, to see whether something can be done in Syria several years ago, but unfortunately Assad didn't take our recommendations.
Yes.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Professor Alexander and the Potomac Institute for inviting me to be a participant in this timely discussion. But I would like to start by stating that my participation in this event is in my personal capacity, and opinions I express or statement I make are strictly mine and do not represent or reflect the opinion of the Law Library of Congress or any other U.S. government entities. The Middle East security concerns are many, and you have listened to few. Among these concerns, there are three that are, in my opinion, important to address. First, the Shia-Sunni divide. Second, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And third, the economic disparity among states and people in the Middle East. The Sunni-Shia divide is a renewed manifestation of a deep-rooted political division dating back to the 7th century. This division was initiated by the partisans of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, and it was solidified by the brutal murder of Al-Hussein, son of Ali and the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. His murder came about when he tried to challenge the legitimate ascension of Muawiyah's son, Yazid, to power. This division was later transformed into a theological debate about the nature of political power in Islam. The Shia, who constitute about 10 to 15% of the Muslim population worldwide, represent, according to a 2009 Pew Research Center survey, 90 to 95% in Iran, 65 to 70% in Iraq, and 45 to 55% in Lebanon. And of course, they are the majority in Bahrain, and there are substantial minorities in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia. What's new about the Shia-Sunni divide today is the role Iran is playing as a major regional power in the Middle East. Since Al-Khomeini revolution, Iran seems to have decided to penetrate the Arab world through mainly a two-pronged policy. First, by co-opting the Arabs on the issue of Jerusalem, which is the second sacred city in Islam. And second, by forging close ties with the Shia population in Lebanon, Iraq, and elsewhere. This policy seems to have been successful and epitomized in Lebanon through the creation of Hezbollah at a time when the Lebanese state was disintegrating into religious, sectarian fiefdoms of belligerent parties. To counter the Iran policy, most Arab countries that are governed by Sunni Muslim elites seem to have relied on reviving the Sunni-Shia divide rather than on addressing grievances of their Shia citizens who suffers, probably along with other groups, from historical neglect, if not persecution. This policy pursued by Iran and the Arab states, whose damaging effects one might detect on the Lebanese political scene, is making the Shia-Sunni divide most difficult to reconcile or resolve peacefully, even though it is not discussed too much in the media, especially after Turkey seems to have decided to enter the fray on the side of the Sunni Muslims and refocus its attention towards reviving its pre-World War I role in the central government, as the central government of the whole Arab Middle East. So this is the first, in my opinion, security concern that's going to play out in the future. The second is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. More than 60 years after the creation of the State of Israel in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still as intractable as it was at any time in the past, if not even worse. All the good-intentioned attempts introduced to resolve the conflict have failed, including the Oslo Accords, upon which high hopes of lasting peace seems to have dissipated into oblivion, and cost, of course, the life of the late Prime Minister Rabin. It is interesting to note that no one is any longer talking about peace per se between Israel and the Palestinians, or between Israelis and the Arabs, but rather all the talks now shifted to the peace process, or the roadmap to peace, not about peace itself. And even about these, talking about the roadmap and about the process, even those are being dissipated. This seems to be the result that everyone has given up. It seems that everyone giving up on finding a lasting solution to this increasingly difficult conflict. In fact, the positions of the parties on the core issues of the conflict have not softened or changed, despite the peace treaties concluded between Israel and Egypt, and between Israel and Jordan, and probably between Israel and other, and the table like Qatar and other Arab states. The Palestinian and Arab public opinion is still insisting, for example, on the right of the Palestinian refugees to return to their lands within Israel proper, as an essential part of any peaceful solution, while the Israelis are more adamant than ever in taking the opposite position. In 1931, David Ben-Gurion, referring to Palestinian Arabs, stated, "Their right to live in Palestine, develop it, and win national autonomy is as incontrovertible as is ours to return. We must, in our work in Palestine, respect Arab rights." Under such circumstances, any reasonable watcher of the Israeli-Arab conflict cannot but conclude that this conflict is a constant threat to security in the Middle East. The third threat to peace and security is the economic disparity that exists among people and states. And this is another question that very little being discussed in the media or by the policymakers. According to the data collected by the World Bank, the 2011 per capita gross domestic product in US dollars is as follows. In Qatar, the small kingdom or sheikhdom in the Gulf, it's $92,501. In Kuwait, $62,664. In the United Arab Emirates, $45,653. What about Egypt? The per capita is 2,781, from 9,000 in Qatar to 2,700 in Egypt. In Sudan, 1,234. The other economic disparity is among the income realized by the people in each state. For example, the share of income held by the highest and lowest 10% of the population in the following countries is as follows. In Egypt, the highest 10% receive 26.6% of the whole total income. while the lower 10% receive 4% of the total income. In Sudan, it's a 26.7 to 2.7. But look at Qatar. While in Qatar, the difference is even wider. The difference between the top 10 and the lower 10. The highest 10 of the population in Qatar receives 35.9% of the total income, while the lower 10% receives only 1.3%. Now, this income disparity has several consequences and affects directly not only the political loyalty of the individual citizenry of these states, but raises the question of the legitimacy of the existence of some of these nation states whose population or geographic area is smaller than Fairfax County. In fact, most Middle Eastern experts agree that the spark that ignited the revolutions of the Arab Spring has been mostly economic rather than religious, or political, or ideological. Let me close before Professor Alexander raises his card by emphasizing that none of these security concerns seem to have ready-made solution. There is no solution to any of these three issues that I mentioned, or that they could be resolved without a real collaborative, genuine efforts on the part of all the players within and outside the Middle East, if we were to expect a stable, secure, and safe future in that region. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isam, for pointing at the three challenges. You know, I'm obviously tempted to ask you some questions, but I will have an opportunity later on in terms of the economic, for example, whether you also consider the grave humanitarian issue of the refugees in Lebanon and Turkey, for example, in Jordan and so forth. Our last panelist, as I said, to make brief opening remarks is Dr. Tawfiq Hamid, who is a physician and is very well known as a Islamic scholar, is dealing with Islamic radicalism. Here with the study, he's a senior fellow at the Potomac, and he has an interesting background. I won't go into details, but I would say that he had a background in the so-called underground in Egypt and associate of apparently Zawahiri, and I think that his views on Egypt would be very enlightening.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you, Professor Alexander. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure and honor to be with you, and thank you, Professor Alexander, and thanks for the Potomac Institute for organizing this event. I will initially just address the current imminent situation in Egypt, then I will address the security concerns and some implications. What's currently happening is a division within the country between not 90% and 10% against. It's between nearly 50 and 50. So the latest election showed that those who went for Mohammed Morsi or who supported him are 51%. Those who were against him completely and supported some guy from the former regime are 50%. When you have such a level of division between two opposing powers, that one of them wants to implement Sharia style of a country, a religious state, another wants real freedom and liberty, then you can imagine the magnitude of the problem. It's not a joke, it's really a serious issue happening. Recently, President Morsi after giving an oath that he will respect the current law and constitution, and after giving promises to the opposition that he will never put the new constitution to referendum before being accepted by the opposition, he actually broke his oath and promises, and he gave himself now a dictatorship power. He now controls the three powers of the country, all the powers in his hands, and he issued what we call Morsi Declaration that caused all the current crisis and the confrontation that's happening at the moment. In the news yesterday, some news came that Morsi canceled the declaration. But when you go to read the Arabic version of it, the first item, it says it cancels the declaration, but kept all the consequences of it valid. It's like canceling a phrase, but keeping the rules that was created by this phrase valid. You might think that does not make any logic for anyone. How come you cancel a phrase and keep the law and the rules that come out of it? This has a deep ideological and theological root in the mind of someone like Muhammad Morsi and the Brotherhood, because the concept of stoning of women in Sharia is not in the Quran. And in Sharia, it's well known that there was a verse in the Quran that justified stoning, but this verse is no longer in the Quran. It was cancelled as a phrase from the Quran, but the rule of the stoning remained. So what Morsi is doing now is he's saying that he cancelled the declaration, but in reality, the outcome of the declaration, the consequences are still valid. So practically, it's just playing with the words. And this made the opposition very furious and crazy. And we are talking here about 50% of the society. And they are becoming aggressive. That is the real worry, that they have been attacked by the Islamists, but they are now returning back. So the confrontation can take a very bloody direction in the next period of time. The U.S. position is very sensitive because it is in a catch-22 situation. If it supported Morsi clearly, then this 50%, and actually they are much more now, will be turning against America more, and it will have, it will damage its image in several places, because it will be seen as supporting an Islamist guy while he broke the basic fundamental rules of democracy. People wonder, where is America? Why is not standing for the basic rules of democracy, not to have all powers in the hand of one person? So if it stood with Morsi, it's really causing a problem with significant percentage within the society. If it stood against him, some people will say now it's against the ballot. And we might have the scenario of Algeria again. The Islamists are coming and saying, oh, if they, after the election, they are still against us, then let us go to the Algerian style of terrorism. And that is very problematic. In my view, the best approach here is not to go support individuals or be against them. Just stand for the principles of liberty and democracy clearly. Because the moment the U.S. Clearly states that it will not accept breaking the rules of democracy, and it will not accept having all powers in the hand of one person, and demand from President Morsi to put the referendum of the Constitution before putting the referendum, he should have the acceptance of the opposition, which are nearly 50%. If the U.S. did this, it can help in bringing more stability. Because if it just remained silent and Morsi went with his declaration and he got approval for this pseudo-constitution that's opposed by more than 50% of the population now, then we are having another trouble. The problem will not be ended, it will be just delayed. When it comes to security concerns, I will mention three important issues that happened after President Morsi came to power. First of all, he allowed the jihadists to come out of prisons. You see the sympathy here with the Islamists. He allowed them to come out of prisons. They are causing chaos in Sinai. Possibly he did so because he wanted them to support him in any uprising that might happen against him. The second is his relation to Hamas organization. A question needs to be answered. How come only within few months after President Morsi came to power, Hamas organization for the first time in its history managed to attack Jerusalem and Tel Aviv with missiles? This was the very first time in the history of Hamas to be able to reach Tel Aviv and Hamas. So when this happened within 3 months of his presidency, then we have to raise several question marks here. The third issue is his first visit was to which country? To Iran. When you have in mind that the Sunni Shia division exists, but when there is an external enemy, they unite very easily. So to rely on that the Sunni and Shia division we can help our interests forever, it's not really very true, because at any moment, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt can be with Iran and putting the case scenario that they have control over the Suez Canal. If Iran developed a nuke, then we deal with the real security concern for the whole world. An Islamist regime in Egypt, ideologically driven regime controlling the Suez Canal, and another ideologically driven Islamist regime in Iran having a nuke. Then we deal with a nightmare, real nightmare. There are two implications, or more than two implications here. One of them for the U.S. Is to realize that it cannot rely anymore fully on cooperation with the Muslim Brotherhood on intelligence issue, because many of them are very sympathizers with the jihadists. Simply, they release them from prison. One of the earliest things they did. This is with evidence. So we cannot rely anymore completely, or we have to understand that there is new rules for this game there. The second is understanding that to avoid wars, in big wars in between the Arabs and Israel, I believe the only thing that can maintain peace in the area is Israel military superiority there. Because as long as the Arabs felt there is near equality, they will start attacking Israel and we will have escalation of the problem. And finally, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Senator, very kindly, we can really move on each topic, but we'll have time now. What I really suggest, in the interest of time, to give the opportunity to each panelist perhaps to make a remark regarding the presentation of remarks of some of the other people, if they wish to do that, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Norm, you want to say something, or?
No, I'll pass.
You pass, okay. Michael?
We'll go to
Anyone?
Well, I mean, what do I get if I pass?
Well, nothing.
Nothing,
You
so I'll say
survived.
something.
Okay, so let me ask you just
not gonna
a
pass.
question, and then we'll open it up. For example, a lot of discussion, I think, covered a great deal of territory. No doubt about it. We cannot do everything. But to me, as an academic, I'm concerned about education. By education, what I see the trend is intensification of education in hatred, propaganda, psychological warfare, the education of the next generation of terrorists. And again, within the limited experience I had, when I interviewed some children in refugee camps in Lebanon and also South Asia, but specifically related to the Arab-Israeli conflict, when you ask them when they were born, where they were born, in a refugee camp in Lebanon, they said they were born in Safad, or they were born in Ramla and so forth. And the point I'm really making is that we have to look beyond the role of the gun also in terms of the intellectual war, the culture of life versus the culture of death. And I wonder whether you're going to deal with that specific challenge, and how are you going to do that?
Right, well, that's a 6-month project, 6-month discussion. However, I will say, first of all, I think that an awful lot of these themes are overstated in terms of the passion and conviction with which people actually hold these views, and the extent to which they are locked into holding these positions. I'm a cultural historian, and spent the first 15 years of my adult life in the archives of the Italian fascist state, reading, all of the stuff, doctrine, and I was interested in ideology and vision of the future and so forth. And I see one of the things that has struck me since growing up is the degree to which beliefs and convictions are linked to real events, and especially in the case of messianic movements. And I think it's something that we lose sight of often. Right, radical Islam is a messianic movement, as fascism was a messianic movement, and National Socialism was a messianic movement, and communism was a messianic movement. All believed, and radical Islamists generally believe today, that their efforts are blessed by an almighty power, and that they are destined to win. And you see this. I mean, when Osama bin Laden was going through a period of great success, he would write these very elegant sermons to the Muslim world and say, why am I winning? Why are we doing so well when, before me, all these pathetic rulers of Saudi Arabia and so forth only failed and became vassals of the infidels? Why? Because, he said, we are practicing a proper form of the religion. We are going back to fundamentals. We are applying the rudimentary principles of the faith, and Allah blesses us and makes us stronger. All right, so at the time when I was reading these things, I said, yes, well, the Führer said things like that too, and so did Comrade Stalin all the time. Why are we winning when they were winning? We're winning because history is on our side, because the decadence of our opponents, all of these things, vast forces. So what happened when they lost? That's the interesting question. What happens when a messianic movement loses? And the answer is, people start to wonder, well, if they won because Allah blessed them, are they now losing because Allah has decided to condemn them? And these are very annoying questions to leaders of movements of this sort, because there's no real answer to it. Right? And so in the case of communism, we had, during the Cold War, an endless debate in this town and elsewhere, which asked a question which was an entrancing question, and about which Wittgenstein would have had a lot of really great things to say. But in any case, the question was, who's our enemy? Are we fighting against the Soviet Empire, a traditional kind of geopolitical, military force, etc., where the rules of the game are known and so forth? Or are we fighting against something called international communism, which is a doctrine and a mass movement, and we have to combat it ideologically, and ergo Congress of Cultural Freedom and all of the radios and so forth, challenging the essence of the doctrine. So anyway, that question, who's our enemy? Is it a mass movement, or is it a thing, a nation state or a multinational state? I don't know the answer to that question to this day. I don't know. But what I do know is that when the Soviet Empire fell, international communism was seriously weakened. And as of the moment that the wall came crumbling down, you found very few people saying, I'm a communist, because they no longer believed that history and the rules of history, or let alone God, had decreed that this force would win, and they wanted to be on the winning side, and so forth. So what I'm saying is today, and you can see it in Iraq, if there were a way of reliably tracking the, let's call it, popularity of al-Qaeda in Iraq, how many people liked it, how many people didn't or don't?
Down.
Right? At the beginning, it was very high because it was, fight the invader, the infidel, et cetera, had great support. Then what happened, to oversimplify it only a bit, is we defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated by the United States Marine Corps. And it was a combination of al-Qaeda in Iraq and Iran, because Iran was seen as being hand in glove, because those people over there knew what most of the American political class and agitators and media refused to admit, which was that the two were working hand in glove, despite the Sunni Shia thing, about which I want to say just one word at the end. So popularity for al-Qaeda went way down. And as of the end of the war, let's call it the end of the surge, as of that moment, popularity of al-Qaeda was way down. Why? Because they'd lost. Right? Take Machiavelli. I mean, it's all about winners and losers. People don't like losers. Losers are not popular. And so when people say our commitment to death is greater than your commitment to life, well, maybe, but only so long as they think they're winning. When they think they're losing, or when they say they're losing, the enthusiasm for death diminishes. It's not as great as it was. So there is this very, and I say this as a failed cultural historian, the culture is somewhat less important than one might be inclined to believe. Politics is an independent variable. Life and death, yes, are serious, but you measure them in real terms. Okay. Yes. Finally, the Sunni Shia thing. I have fought a failing campaign against taking Sunni Shia divisions as being profound and unbridgeable and so forth. And I fought it for a very long time. The Iranians, the one place in the Middle East that I know something about, because I don't do Arabs, so I don't pretend to know about them, but people say, Iranians can't get along well with Arabs. Well, there's a sub-theme to that, which is very nasty and ugly, which is if you look at the Iranians and their claim that our commitment to death is greater than your commitment to life, it doesn't apply to themselves. It applies to Arabs that they dupe into killing themselves and killing us, right? You won't find many Iranians blowing themselves up. It's very hard to find an Iranian suicide terrorist running around, you name it, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Iraq at the time, and so forth. For the most part, they're Saudis, Yemenis, et cetera, Sunnis, who have been indoctrinated by the Iranians, and then they go and blow themselves up. They are the suicide terrorists. Just look at the numbers. I mean, there's no arguing with the data in this case, right? So what are the Iranians doing? The Iranians are deriving a double pleasure. They're killing us, and at the same time, they're getting some stupid Sunni Arab to blow himself up and do their dirty work for them. They love that. And when you talk to Iranians, they will tell you that, after you get to know them and so forth. I've been at this now for more than 30 years with Iranians. And I've never found, hatred of Arabs anywhere that remotely compares to the popular cultural conviction of most Iranians that I've met. So yes, Sunni Shia, yes, there's a division, and it comes out here anecdotally, and it comes out in strategy also. But their ability to work with Sunnis, that's not stopped at all by the Sunni Shia divide, either on the Iranian side or on the Sunni Arab side. They do work together. And they, to the point where the Sunni Arabs are actually willing to blow themselves up on behalf of a program that is brought to them by Shiite Persians, which is really something quite amazing when you stop to think about it. Anyway, I'll stop there.
That's okay. I mean, we can spend a semester on that.
That's it, right.
We're speaking about red lines, and in my mind, I wonder whether we do have ecumenical red lines. In other words, to diffuse some of the negative theological elements from political conflict. But Isam, you want to respond on this?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Sonny,
you spoke eloquently.
Speak to the mic, speak to the mic.
And Iran, I think, is a very important regional power. And what Iran does is very calculated for what they perceive as the national interest of Iran. They are not religious fanatics, but there is a question that they are exploiting, which is the Sunni-Shia divide, which is historical, which exists, which is real. Now, isn't there a solution? I think there would be a solution, of course, but the problem exists, and the problem has to be addressed, and the problem is being successfully used by Iran to penetrate the Arab world in a big way. Now, when you see Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon, you can be sure that whatever Iran wants, Hezbollah probably will do when it comes to the national interest probably of Iran. But the problem exists, and the problem has to be addressed, in my opinion. We cannot just forget about it and put it under the table. So this is my...
Yeah, okay, everybody will have a chance. Dr. Kumar, you want to?
I'll do hold.
Your pass, okay? You,
Yeah, you want
Vivek, you want to?
me or Kamar?
I'm passing for now.
Me?
Yeah.
Yes. Just commenting on Michael Dean's vision about communism, and I'm saying that I agree with it, and this model may actually happen in the Muslim world, and it's happening now, because the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, came with the slogan that Islam is the solution. So when they came to power, everyone was expecting they will bring solutions to all the problems of the country in a short period of time, because they are supported by Allah, and they are supported by almighty power that's beyond normal descriptions. So what happened because of the failures that's happening in the country economically and socially? They didn't feel that the slogan Islam is the solution, which was fundamental to the rising of the phenomenon of Islamism. They didn't see it really working. So you see now on Facebook, on Twitter, everywhere, there is a significant wave against the Islamists. I call it the anti-Islamist movements now rising, and to your surprise, it's rising very quickly and extremely powerful now. So I have been into fighting radical Islam for 30 years. 28 years of them I was just by myself and with very few people. But now I see there is significant movement. Most of my older friends who were against my views are turning now to these views. So I see that Islam, Islamism, while winning politically to some extent, is losing ideologically. This is how I see it, and this can help ending Islamism phenomena as communism collapsed. So that is what I see now. Is the main fear is the economical problems. If it went too bad, it can start an escalation of other forms of radicalism. But otherwise, the concept of making the brotherhood model fail in a country like Egypt is like making communism fail in Russia. The consequences can be the same on the ideology.
Okay, we'll come back to some of these issues. I would like to open it up with people in the audience who have very rich experience in the academic and government and all that. So I'm going to call on you, and I would appreciate if you identify yourself and ask a question. If you want to make a speech, we'll invite you to our next session. Okay, I think Dr. Rafali here, who is a specialist on Iraq. Yeah, please use the mic.
Yeah, I would like to make 3 comments. First, what happened recently in the Arab countries is the destruction of what they call haybat al-hukm, or the mystical authority, of the ruler. It does not exist anymore. This is really the most fundamental change, long-term change in the Arab countries. We have to take this into consideration. Secondly, there was a mention of Hamas and Egypt. I think the Israelis should realize that Hamas is the strongest supporter of the peace between Israel and Egypt. Strongest supporter. Why? They need Egypt as intermediary in any future conflict between them and Israel. And you will never hear a Hamas leader, whether Mashal or Hania, call on Egypt to sever the peace agreement with Israel. And the third comment is somebody mentioned here, the Sunni-Shia divide. Actually, the divide today is a tripartite. The Sunni, Shia, and Wahhabi. If you look at what Qatar is doing, Qatar is mobilizing the Sunni element of Islam against the Wahhabi. In fact, the Wahhabis, the Saudis, is the only country, Muslim country in the Middle East, whose clerics still advocate that the people should adhere to the authority of the rulers. It is no longer the case in Egypt, it's no longer the case in Syria, it's no longer the case in Iraq. So these are really fundamental changes I think will have long-term impact on how these regimes will emerge in the near future. Thank you.
So thank you for the comments, no question. Now, any comments from the panel to that? Agree, disagree?
Agree.
Or keep it? Okay. We'll move on. Please identify yourself.
My name is Albert McKenzie. I just have a question for Dr. Ladin. Did I misunderstand you, or were you advocating U.S.-American covert action against Iran, such as an assassination of Khomeini?
I don't know what you're smoking. I never said a word about it. I did, but I talked about supporting the people of Iran, didn't I?
Yes.
3 or 4 different times when I said that we should support people who share our values and our common ideals. I didn't say one word about anything military, paramilitary, covert, or any such thing. Is that clear? Thank you.
Okay, we'll get in the back. Mike, speak louder so we can hear.
Thanks very much for the wide-ranging presentation. I'm Mike Kraft, a counterterrorism specialist, but my question really goes back earlier at something Dr. Ladin mentioned, being a cultural historian. I'm struck by the role of emotion in the security issues in the Middle East. And it goes back to 1967 war when I was on the Middle East desk for UPI back when it was a big outfit. And the wave of emotions behind Nasser prompted, for various reasons, the path to war in '67. I'm reminded about this by demonstrations in Gaza with the Hamas leader coming back, etc. And you mentioned the Sunni-Shiite split. My question is really, to what extent are we dealing with a deep cultural problem, difficulty in accepting compromise, the fact that Sunnis and Shias are murdering each other, the thousands by, 13th century dispute over succession to Muhammad, the inability to accept pragmatic compromises like the UN original partition plan, what's happening in Iraq, the difficulties in power sharing, and in Syria among the opposition, and Libya. Boils down to, are we dealing with a cultural issue of inability to accept compromise and pragmatic? And if so, are we faced like several hundred years like with the Europeans during the Middle Ages?
Okay. Anyone? Yes, please.
Yeah, what I mentioned, I think this is a problem. How you solve it, I think you can solve it, but you cannot solve it except when the parties come together and try to solve it. For example, even now, when Saudi Arabia and Iran get together and try to diffuse anything that might happen, they are able to do that. In other words, it's not cultural in the sense that you cannot overcome it, but unless you bring all the parties concerned and have some kind of a peaceful program that everyone buy in, you cannot solve these problems. You cannot solve it by force. You cannot solve it by one party taking a position against the others. You have to have all the parties to come together and to find a solution. Then you can find a solution. As I closed my remarks, that unless you have a broader collective action in the Middle East, it's very difficult to address all the security concerns that are there.
I would like to add to that maybe one point. Cultures do change in history. It's a long process, but they do change, and things that seems to us impossible at the moment become natural later on. Think about slavery. Think about segregation here in the United States. You see changes. It's a long process. You have to support them with strong political mechanisms sometimes that will create a situation that in future generation it will look like something that is natural. Nobody will think that United States will go back to the time of segregation, or that South Africa suddenly will change. And in some places it works, and in some places it collapses. But it's our responsibility to try and lead to that change.
Yeah, and actually, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Oni?
Yeah, it's,
Oh, I'm
just
sorry.
fast comment about this. I agree that culture can change, and especially when we live in the era of the internet, things actually can happen faster than we could imagine. What the changes that happen ideologically in the last couple of years in Egypt and in the Arab world, with people speaking against traditional anachronistic style of thinking within Islam, I see there is a change, and the internet is making it faster. And in fact, when you see countries that have the lowest internet penetration per capita in the Muslim world, they are Somalia, Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Taliban. And you see a lot of terrorism coming from these areas. And I found a sort of an initial correlation, positive correlation between the more internet penetration, despite the negative aspect of the possibility of spreading radical views, but you see the overall effect actually is toward more reformation and change in the society. So I do agree that culture can change, and we have such technology, such as the internet, we can really make a lot of changes if we have effective programs.
Right. Okay, we'll come back to that. I think Dr. Oni?
Milton Honig, they say that 2013 is going to be a year of decision on Iran with respect to its nuclear program. The sanctions are getting more severe, imposed by the United States and the EU. So the question is, if diplomacy doesn't result in a grand bargain on Iran's nuclear program, the other possibility is a preemptive attack by Israel or the United States. What do you think about this idea of 2013 being a year of decision in this matter?
That I heard it about 2009, 2010, 2011, and 2012. It's very hard to get to the real decision. I mean, I would have thought, as you know, I mean, for me, the nuclear question is not the central issue. The central issue is that they're killing us. And we're obliged, it seems to me, we've long since been obliged to do something in response to that. There are, in fact, lots of different ways to deal with it, with an imminent Iranian nuclear weapon. And it's not restricted to simply negotiation sanctions on the one hand and military action on the other. I've always been opposed to military action. I've always thought it was crazy. And a footnote here, parents of men and women in uniform don't usually support military action, contrary to some stereotypes that run around. In any case, I think military action against Iran is both a mistake and unnecessary, because the regime is hollow, because it's ready to fall. I'm profoundly convinced there have been several occasions in the last 20, 30 years in Iran where if an American president had had the good character to stand up and say, we stand with the people of Iran, we're opposed to this regime. We condemn this regime. This regime kills our men and women. And, I mean, especially now when we caught them planning to blow up some kind of explosive outside a restaurant with glass windows in Washington, D.C., which would have hurt and killed lots of Americans, right? Why don't we condemn them for what they do to us? I mean, it's really a personal thing. And I promise you that if you read carefully the statements that the Iranian regime makes about the President of the United States, they include some of the most ugly racial epithets that you can possibly imagine. Phrases and words that if one of us ever dared to use them, which we wouldn't, we would be locked away for hate speech and so on, and yet nothing happens. And still, you know, when they turn out in the streets of Tehran and Isfahan and Tabriz and Shiraz, they carry big signs saying, Obama, where are you? Right? They want us. So we're both morally obliged to help them, I think, and strategically guided to help them, because they are the most dangerous weapon against that regime. And bringing down that regime is the most effective form of arms control. Because, you know, there are regimes in the world, governments in the world that have nukes. We don't worry about them. We worry about Iran because Iran has that kind of regime, which chants death to America and means it. So, I mean, so it just seems to me that we'd have, that by focusing obsessively on the nuclear question, we miss the big issue, the main issue, and that if we had what seems most likely to follow the end of the Islamic Republic, you would get a government which is basically pro-Western, not excessively religious. To steal a line from Kissinger of some years ago, the Iranian people have been effectively vaccinated against Islamism, against radical Islam. They've had it, right? They've lived under it. They don't like it. And so they're not going to embrace it and resort to it. So, I mean, that's probably the best. That's the best. And yet that's a strategy that hardly anybody ever talks about. Just as long as we're talking about things people don't talk about, you will see that in almost every article written about Iranian-American relations, there is always the line, we seem to be getting close to finally, for the first time, direct one-on-one talks between the United States and Iran. Well, one-on-one direct talks between the United States and Iran have been going on uninterruptedly, nonstop since 1979, and still are today. They happen all the time. So, you know, that's yet another myth about the way the world doesn't work.
I would like to offer a bit different perspective. I think that first, a regime change in Iran is something that is desired. We simply think that if there are two trains, one train that is a nuclear train and one train is a train of a regime change, the train of the nuclear ambition is the fast train, and the other one stops at every station on the way. It means that it's much slower. And we believe that if the Iranian nuclear train will reach its target, it will reach its destination earlier, then it will be much more difficult to change the regime in Tehran. And exactly as you said, we, as Michael said, we also believe that war or military operation, which is not war, is the worst option. And we would prefer not to use it, but we don't take it off the table, because if it's there, the other side might slow down, might understand that that might be the blow that will lead maybe to a regime change. And that will change his opinion. So I'm not speaking about time. If you want to know the time frame, when, from an Israeli perspective, it was given by our prime minister when he was speaking in the UN, when the only visible part of the nuclear program will be 90% completed. That will be the time. Today, the Iranian has about 500 pounds of low-enriched uranium to the degree of 20%. Technologically, from that to 93% that is needed for a nuclear weapon, the way is very quick. Therefore, this is the time that we will have to operate if they will reach enough materials, 90%, as our prime minister said, to build. That will be sufficient for a bomb. We believe that there is a good chance that maybe Iran will not continue with that process. We'll slow it down. That's what we hope. But if not, all options remain on the table.
Okay, both Rubish from the library. You need the mic, 1 second.
Again, like my colleague Issam, I do not express any views of the Library of Congress or any other government institutions. This is a personal thought. Would you think that by Iran getting the nuclear capability of maybe building them on rockets, not just having nuclear capability, the worry in the West and in the East as well is not so much that they are going to use it, because that would be really dumb, unless you believe that fanaticism makes people do impractical things. But the fear may be that it will give Iran such a high leverage in the Middle East that they could control even further or even in a stronger way than what their position is currently in the Middle East. So this is the fear in the Middle East as well as in the West and other countries.
Can I ask you a question? Do you not believe that fanaticism leads people to do crazy things?
I do, and yeah, I do believe fanaticism can make people to do irrational things. That is correct.
So
but even if they didn't, I think that could be very dangerous in other ways.
Because you're in a paradox, aren't you? If you say that fanaticism doesn't lead people to do crazy things, so they won't do crazy or stupid things, then even if they get nuclear weapons, it shouldn't change anything, since the same argument applies, because you would just as easily say, okay, well, they have it, but not to worry,
It does
because
change.
they're not going to do crazy things.
It does change, because the perception of others will be that they could use it.
Not if they perceive it the way you perceive it.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Or the implied, or the implication of the way. That is, if most people believe they're not going to use it anyway because it's crazy or stupid or whatever you want to call it. So if that's what we believe, then who cares if they have it or don't have it? They're not going to use it, and so it won't change anything.
Well, in any event, it is a dangerous
For it to have strategic importance, you have to believe that it's possible for them to use it, that they
Yes.
might use it. That's all I'm saying.
And people do believe that they may. So
I
that-
think they're
that's my
right,
point, yeah.
but, you know, that's...
So the question is, with regard to the time limit, really we're talking about, like you said, we were talking for several years. That's not the issue of when they will have the capability, but rather this is what they are acting towards, achieving this capability.
Okay, I'm sorry, I think we would have to move on, and I would like to give the panel an opportunity to make the final remarks today before I turn it over to General Riss. Any pressing points that you want to make?
Well, maybe in my closing remarks, I will say something about peace prospects in the Middle East. You know, we are very pessimistic, and we are in a period of change. And I go back to what I said about cultural change and about the need really to promote the idea of peace in the Middle East. When Israel comes to the table, unlike maybe what was said before by Issam Saliwa, we are not only thinking about renewing peace process. We really think about peace, and we think about peace because we believe that is an Israeli interest. We believe that that's part of the security, the future security of the state of Israel. That's why the vast majority of Israelis and Israeli governments has accepted the idea that we have to share the land with our Palestinian neighbors. It doesn't mean that we are going to commit suicide. And therefore, when people speak about return of refugees, we have no reservation that they will come to the future Palestinian state, but not into Israel, because that will mean the disintegration of Israel and the idea of Israel as the Jewish state. However, we are ready for the task, and in fact, our main frustration in the last 4 years is that we were not put to the test. We call repeatedly from the UN podium in 2011 and from the UN podium in 2012 and in Bar Ilan and in other from other podiums and different forums and forums to the Palestinians to come and negotiate with us, seriously. And we are not naive. We know that there are serious issues on the table, and we are not naive. We know that the Middle East of today is very different from the Middle East of 2008. The Palestinian state that was so-called recognized by the UN lacked territorial integrity and lacked the ability to go. Their leadership cannot test itself in election, and the institutions are not strong enough. And yet we understand that we need to move constructively. And what we call the other side is to put us to the test around negotiating table. As I said, we can do things and we can take care of our own security interests, which are not only security, but involve other interests. We touch the very issues of self-identity of us as a nation, as the Palestinians. Will have to come with their own issues that touches their own self-identity. But we don't want to do it alone, and we don't want to keep a kind of deadlock, which is bad for both people. So this call remains on the table, and we hope that one day it will be executed. We believe that constructive things can be done, even in the very unstable environment that we are living in. In fact, if people will ask me, nobody asked me about the Israeli reaction to the non-member state, I would say that this is a serious call for the Palestinians to come back to the table. From Israeli perspective, what they did is irreversible. They went to the UN, they broke and breached the fundamental basics of our agreement, and yet they are the partners. Yet they will have to come to the table. And then we won't need to move in a kind of more unilateral approach, but we can do it together. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else wants to make a comment before turning it over? Yes.
Yeah, first comment about that. When I see Germany during the Nazi time and I see it today, it's a huge difference between people who were burning millions of people in the ovens and now with civilization that try to respect human rights. And the role of education here was fundamental. So within just a few decades, education significantly changed the whole society, whole way of thinking to a different aspect. So what I'm saying here is that this war that's happening now in the world is we should not look at it as war at only physical places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, but we have to shift the confrontation area to what I call Brainistan, here in the mind. And this needs two important things: education, effective education, not just education, to fight radicalism, and psychological warfare operations properly done to weaken these radical minds. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, now, since I'm the moderator, I'm not going to, obviously, to conclude the very rich contribution, but as an optimist, I can assure all of us that we're going to discuss these issues the next 50 years. And with that optimism, I would like to ask our distinguished colleague, General David Risk, who is the Vice President in the Potomac Institute, dealing with strategy and planning division. He had very rich experience in the staff and command assignment, including Iraq, and I asked him to just make the final remarks. Please.
Your Honor, as always, thank you very much. Please, a round of applause for the outstanding panel and remarks that we heard today. Well, we heard a lot of points, talk of religion, God, Allah, and as I heard that God and Allah, I thought to myself, it reminds me when Lincoln was asked during the Civil War if God was on his side, and his response was, I hope I am on the side of God.
Yeah.
Lincoln, in his brilliance, has a way of putting things in very succinct terms and makes you think. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, that only reinforces it. I applaud you all to see it. I couldn't help, as I was thinking and saw the title also, and looking at what the United States does, as all countries have to look at what they do. And I'll take us back to the first president of our nation, President George Washington. And Washington was only going to serve one term. And in 1792, he was prepared to give his farewell address. And Madison helped him craft that. Well, he got talked into serving another term. And Hamilton revised his speech in 1796. And at that point in time, the complexities of our young nation were different than today. But the gist of Washington's remarks dealt with how the United States deals with other nations. Let me cover some of those. Washington advocated a policy of good faith and justice towards all nations, and he urged American people to avoid long-term friendly relations or rivalries with any nation. He urged these attachments and animosity towards nations will only cloud the government's judgment in its foreign policy. Washington argued that long-standing poor relations only lead to unnecessary wars. Washington continued his warning on alliances, claiming that they often lead to poor relations with nations who feel that they are not being treated as well as American allies and threaten to influence the American government into making decisions based upon the will of their allies instead of the will of the American people. Washington continued and made an extended reference to the dangers of foreign nations who seek to influence the American people and the government. If George Washington was alive today and had an opportunity to comprehend and understand, I wonder what he would say about our nation, and then what the leaders of the nations that have been mentioned here today would say about theirs. Yonah, thank you again very much. Thank you all for attending.